Hello and welcome to the Vooma podcast series, Let's Talk Faith. The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic put many faith leaders under pressure as communities were knocked sideways by the events of 2020. But now we are further down the line. Let's find out how things have changed. We're joined by the Reverend Glynis Goins, a retired minister at St. Francis Presbyterian Church, Waterkloof. As a hobby, she writes poetry, especially sonnets and haiku. I do have a surprise for you later, Glynis. I promised. We're going to get to that. But for now, I would love to know, early stages of the pandemic, we are still trying to understand what is this about, what's it going to do to us, how is government going to react, what's going to happen to our everyday lives. That was a tremendous sense of fear. How did you react? How did your church react to that time?
So we had advance notice, of course, the few days before we went into lockdown. And immediately my young colleague minister and I sat together. We said we needed a strategy as we went into lockdown. And so we sat together during those 3 days and we discussed how we would hold. We had a concern about how we would hold the sense of community together of the St. Francis congregation. We sat together and we discussed what we ought to do around that. How would we go into a position where we would not miss any of the Sunday services? And of course we had the Easter services coming up. So there were significant services coming up. And we are not a high-tech congregation. We're a fairly small congregation, only just over 100 members, and not a lot of money to expend on technology. So we sat together and we said, right, how are we going to do this? How will we continue journeying with the congregation in terms of worship? And we determined we would not be able to do live services, online approach to things, that we would pre-record those services. Really? We would do homemade videos of them. We also realized that we had a radically different degrees of technological expertise and capacity in the congregation. It's a very diverse congregation, diverse in terms of age, in terms of culture and race, and economically diverse, from people working as gardeners and domestics all the way through to professionals. And so we knew that we would have to work on different platforms, multiple platforms. So part of our strategy was to say we will produce all of the Sunday services, we will pre-record them as videos without the focus being on us. We didn't want to hog center stage as people, and so we used a PowerPoint kind of approach where we used visuals and then we did voiceovers and so on. And so we weren't dominant in those services. And we got going immediately. So we never missed a Sunday.
So this was just in the first few days, even before lockdown.
And so we kicked in immediately. We agreed that we had an interesting one because there is a Tenebrae service and the Presbyterians have a thing about who may and may not serve communion. And Tenebrae includes the sacrament of communion. And so we agreed that we would handle that remotely and that we would bless the elements remotely, but that people would prepare their own sacramental elements at home, and we would go ahead with that Tenebrae service at the start of Easter. That was all around the worship.
Right.
But we then spoke about how will we keep a sense of community together. We agreed we needed to set up WhatsApp groups. We had 8 WhatsApp groups we set up. We had a very up-to-date membership roll. So we had only one person whose details were not correct.
Oh, really?
Otherwise, and we then heard she'd returned to Malawi. So we actually had 100% contact with our congregation. We agreed we would have regular phone calls and we would have an actual structured program of how we would phone and contact people. We would introduce daily devotions in order to reach people on a regular basis, and we would continue to have fellowship events online. And so all of those things were developed as part of the strategy. So we went into that initial level 1 lockdown with a whole strategy in place.
In terms of the anxiety of how do we manage this? One of the things that I think added to the anxiety was that we didn't know how long is this going to last.
Yes, and we underestimated without any shadow of a doubt, and because of that our strategy was inadequate. We had not catered adequately for how we would hold. One of our passions was multi-generational events and building friendships between young people and the much older age bracket, and we hadn't adequately thought about how we would do that, how we would cater for the children who could no longer come to Sunday school. We didn't have Sunday school material in place. And so that was an inadequacy. And we had to revisit our strategy once we realized this COVID was with us to stay for much longer. And we had to then add additional strategies to deal with that.
How do you think people felt about the prospect of a vaccine? This is going back to a time when we didn't know that we might even have a vaccine. How did people take that?
There was all this hype and I don't know, conspiracy theories and peculiar things that came up. We emphasized the fact that God chooses to work through people. He chooses to work through medical people, and He gifts people with that. And so we emphasized that medically, that as a faith-based institution, there was no reason to be suspicious of God working through the medical profession in order to provide vaccinations, and that there was a social responsibility in order to overcome the disease that required that, regardless of reservations, people really owed it to each other to be vaccinated. Now, we didn't have a lot of resistance. In fact, our congregation was quite enlightened in their response to the vaccinations, but they became anxious because they registered for vaccinations and then initially didn't hear where they should go or what should happen, and they felt that nothing was happening. That was prior to the intense rollout of the vaccinations.
Yeah. Well, we'll be back after the short break. Welcome back. Glynis, I did promise you a surprise earlier. This one is for you. Me alone. Try to feel normal. Failing because it is not. A haiku for you. What do you think of that?
Yes, that's great. Do I follow with a haiku?
Well, I would love to get all your poetry and haiku.
Because that's the point of a haiku, is I take your last line and I start a new one.
Is that how it works? I didn't know that. Our producer, Ted, found this and thought it'll be a lovely moment just to share this haiku. But he didn't tell me the full story, obviously.
Yes, it's lovely.
It was a very interesting moment that we had reached in our conversation earlier about how people were dealing with their anxiety, and you mentioned that they had registered because they were enlightened and that they knew the value of the vaccine, but they hadn't heard any response, and that maybe added to the uncertainty.
Yes, I think the slowness of the response left them feeling that the vaccinations were not really being rolled out as was being intended. And they had a concern about that. But it was not only the people within the congregation. There were many people who were raising questions about the slow rollout of the vaccinations. And so, in fact, we discussed it as church leaders, and we decided that what we should do is pursue the idea of offering the church premises as a vaccination centre. A lot of people were a bit concerned about the safety of going to certain of the vaccination points, just because it required, in some cases, going to the centre of Pretoria and so on. And so we did a little bit of a research, and we put the word out there, and we said we're investigating whether we can use the church premises for this purpose. Is there an interest in this? And that went viral. So it was circulated to our own internal WhatsApp groups. But people on those WhatsApp groups sent them to others and others and others. And so I started getting phone calls and responses. In fact, we ended up with more than 200 people, most of those outside the congregation, who were very keen to come to the premises to have vaccinations. So I then started the process of trying to investigate how to approach the Department of Health in order to put that in place. But in the meantime, the government moved and they started getting the rollout going. People started hearing. So I would then get phone calls from people who'd given their names to me for the list to say, it's okay, we've now been able to go and have the vaccinations. So I could see that things were progressing. And I then heard we would have complications about storing the vaccination. You need special cool facilities and so on. And so we looked at it, we revisited it, and we said, no, it looks as though things are lifting off. And so we then withdrew, and I went back to all 200 people who'd been on my list and said to them, we've withdrawn because things are happening and there are complications, so please no, it won't be done.
To me, it sounds as if your church, your leaders, the faith leaders in the church had decided that it still falls within the scope of your work to reimagine your role in that moment, to say we can become a center for the vaccines. People can come here and they can receive their jab. So it was almost a reinterpretation of what it is that you had been doing traditionally in that space.
No, it wasn't, because pre-COVID, we had very seriously looked at our facilities and said to ourselves, our facilities are underutilized. And so we need to work on making our facilities available. We spoke about launching a Christian community center, which would do things like providing job-related skills, job application skills, health-related talks, quite a wide-ranging number of different activities running from the premises, and that was brought to a halt. We could do none of that because of lockdown. And so we couldn't pursue that, and that was frozen, that was put on ice. And so when we spoke about this, we said, well, this is within our vision of wanting to utilize our facilities for community benefits. And so this makes sense, makes good sense.
At the time then, when people started to take the vaccines, there was almost a growing sense of confidence about getting back to our normal lives. Did you see that, or did you see still some caution and hesitancy?
No, we saw a tremendous growth in confidence. We did see those who were still cautious, and we continued for quite a long time with all of our precautionary measures. We had reduced our capacity by moving chairs out of the church, so I could immediately see when we reached 50% capacity and so on. We continued with taking temperatures and masks and sanitizing and the whole toot for a long time. But we saw an increase in attendance, both at church events, slowly, gently. It grew and grew. And then the children started, parents started bringing their children, which they'd been reticent about before. People wanted to stay and talk after the services. There was a growing confidence in attending fellowship events and so on. There were questions raised about when can we start up with small group Bible studies again and so on. So definitely there was an increase in confidence, and we had, by that stage, I think we had 100% vaccinate, all of our members and their children and families had been vaccinated.
As part of your strategy, you had introduced some technological measures and communications with your congregation, also building new partnerships. Do you still have some of those in place, even though the threat of COVID is somewhat decreased? Yes.
So we have continued to circulate videos of the Sunday services to people. There will need to be a strategic decision about whether to continue with that, because now it's very easy for people to worship at home and not to gather at the church. And so there are questions about how many people are taking the easy way out and are staying at home. But yes, that is still in place, and the multiple platforms, because we had some people who didn't access the videos, but they received sermon notes via email. So we worked in different areas. We also introduced a much more active Facebook page. But in fact, what we found was we had people from overseas, Ireland and Australia and so on, who were actually tapping in. So our congregation then, the worship became a multinational event, not in vast numbers, but in sufficient numbers to make it quite exciting for us.
An exciting time always when St. Francis goes international. Join us again next time on Vooma Podcast, Let's Talk Faith, where we will further unpack the crucial role community, faith and faith leaders have played in helping us all through the ongoing COVID crisis. And remember, COVID-19 has not gone away. And being vaccinated greatly reduces your chances of severe illness, long COVID, hospitalization and even death. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.